This episode of the podcast is sponsored by ARO Resources in honor of the podcast. If anyone has any questions, comments, or feedback, or would like to support the podcast or to sponsor an episode, please email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Rebecca Jefferson, who is the curator of the Issa and Ray Price Library of Judaica at the University of Florida. And she's the author of the brand new book, The Cairo Genizah and the Age of Discovery in Egypt, the History and Provenance of a Jewish Archive, which is about the discovery and the history and the origins of the Cairo Genizah. That's what we'll be discussing. So thank you, Dr. Jefferson, for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you.
So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Oh, my stories is probably as crazy as some of the figures in my book. Well, I suppose I could start way back and say that on my mother's side of the family, we're Eastern European Orthodox Jews who ended up in the east side of London. Eventually, my branch of the family becoming socialists and Zionists. On my father's side of the family, they're sort of Anglican, largely conservative, skilled, working class, roots all over the United Kingdom. So a real hodgepodge, actually. But growing up, I had a real fascination with Israel, and I went to live there for several years, which is where I learned Hebrew, and then came back to study Hebrew. And it was actually while I was studying Hebrew at the University College London that I first heard the story of the Cairo Genizah. And it was told to us in an undergraduate class, and I was completely and utterly hooked. It was such a wonderful story, so legendary sounding, and the instructor, Dr. Saphir, talked about how there were probably 1,000 PhDs still to be done on this massive archive, and probably about a third of it still left to discover what the contents are. And so I was really, really drawn to this, and then went to study the collection at Cambridge as part of a PhD. And then, because I was just enamored of this collection, went to work with it in the University of Cambridge for 12 years.
Okay, so how did you come to write a book on the Cairo Genizah then?
Right. Well, while working with the collection, at one point, the director of the Genizah Research Center worked closely with a Canadian philanthropist, Dov Friedberg, to come up with the idea of getting all of these disparate Genizah fragments of Genizah manuscripts spread around the world online, to scan them, digitize them, and make them available to scholars around the world through their computers. I mean, absolutely phenomenal idea. But down on the ground, that meant that we actually had to count the fragments for the first time, because if you're going to scan them, you have to know how many you need to scan and the costs and et cetera, et cetera. So we had to count every single tiny fragment. And I was involved in that. And it was really at that time that my eyes were open to the notion that it wasn't just this collection at Cambridge. There were collections around the world. And I started to think, well, I've been my world has been the Cambridge Genizah. Where did these other ones come from? And we always talk about Solomon Schechter, who brought the Cambridge Genizah. How did the other ones come about? I mean, I know some of the little stories, but I just became fascinated with it. And slowly over time, I started to do research. And over the past, what has it been now? Perhaps 20 years, I've been publishing articles on the subject and slowly uncovering all these little stories.
So you mentioned something there. I realized we probably should discuss this. You mentioned fragments and the size of the fragments. There are probably listeners listening to this. Some have no idea what the Cairo Genizah is, what a fragment is. I mean, and maybe there are those that know and just are not sure, exactly those specifics. So let's just broadly, very zoom out, a real 30,000 foot view, I guess, of what is the Cairo Genizah, just generally, before we get into all your research and your book, and just what is a fragment and the size of a fragment, just like basics that we could first explain before we get into the actual history.
So, yeah, if we talk about the traditional story as we know it, in a synagogue in Cairo, the Ben Ezra Synagogue, that had been in Cairo for several thousand years, and it sort of stood in one place all that time, had within its walls a Genizah, where sacred texts were stored or discarded, as well as what turned out to be many, many other texts. And slowly these start to come to light in the mid to late 19th century. But mainly, the main story concerns a scholar at Cambridge, a scholar of rabbinics called Solomon Schechter, who, having been alerted to the possibilities of what was stored in this Genizah, went over to Cairo, made this fabulous discovery that within the synagogue walls of the Ben Ezra Synagogue was this Genizah that held manuscripts dating back to the Middle Ages, and not just sacred texts, all manner of texts, documents from medieval Egypt, documents from around the world, letters, children's school books, poetry fragments, as well as important texts, rabbinic commentaries, copies of the Bible, of the Torah, copies of Maimonides' works, pieces of paper with Maimonides' own writing on. It was a phenomenal discovery, and Schechter hauled this massive amount of material, paper fragments, because much of it was fragmentary. It wasn't whole books. It was pages of books or individual documents. And he hauled it back in many, many sacks to the University of Cambridge, where he and another scholar, Charles Taylor, donated it finally to Cambridge University Library. And so today, the Cairo Genizah is essentially that main collection in Cambridge, which today we know is over 190,000 fragments. But in addition to that, there are other collections purportedly from the same place, and indeed they often are, which form part of what is known as this sort of global collection nowadays called the Cairo Genizah. And when people talk about collections from the Cairo Genizah, they're essentially saying that the find spot where they were discovered was the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Egypt. I hope that makes sense the way I said it.
Yeah, sure. And there are, like you said,
complicated.
Right, we'll get into that. I mean, parts of these are in Oxford, JTS, I mean, all over.
Right.
They're all over. So, first of all, just one other thing. When you say a fragment, I know we don't have visual here, and people can Google and they can just characterize a fragment. It's all over. But just at least to define here, what does it mean, a fragment? So there's different sizes in general. How big? What are we talking about when we say a fragment?
Well, a fragment is anything that's not part of a book that's been torn from it. So a page can be a fragment. It's really essentially anything that's not a book, or even anything that's a substantial part of a book, like a quire with many pages. But if it's pages, or it's even torn pages, those are fragments. So anything that's in the age when this was discovered, the 19th century, librarians who were acquiring these materials, if they were given a book or a substantial book, they would record it as such. If it was anything less than a substantial piece of book, it was recorded as fragment. So essentially anything that ranging from tiny piece of torn paper through to several pages can be a fragment. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So okay. So now let's define one other thing. Genizah in general. We mentioned where the Cairo Genizah is,
right.
So that people get more of that. But a Genizah. So listeners may be familiar with the Genizah or not. But certainly so I think define Genizah, and especially as it pertains to the Middle Eastern sense, where a Genizah, what it meant in Egypt, for example, and what the community throughout the centuries would do in these Genizot. Yeah, that's the proper way.
So a Genizah is something that has existed since at least the exilic period. We find the word first used in the Bible in the book of Esther, where the word refers to a treasury. Then we find the word Genizah used in some of the rabbinic texts. In the Mishnah, it's used. There are discussions on all pertaining to what sort of text should you rescue from a fire on Shabbat. And so essentially trying to determine levels of sanctity for various types of writing. Of course, the Torah is the top level of sanctity. And then there are discussions about the things that surround the Torah, the mantle and everything else, and what you should do with these things, once they are no longer being used. And then there are discussions in the Talmud surrounding Genizot and what sort of material deserves to go in a Genizah. And through all of these, we get the impression that a Genizah is a place where you either hide or store a text of a text with a certain level of sacredness attached to it. Essentially, anything that contains the name of God or would be consigned to a Genizah. And so a Genizah, as it evolves over time, becomes this storage place in a synagogue or around a synagogue, and you store it there, you preserve it there, you hide it there until such time as you take it out and give it a burial. Solomon Schechter himself has this wonderful description of the level of sanctity and respect that you pay to a sacred text is the same. You pay the same respect that you would a human body, and in the same way that you shield the human body from being viewed once it's died, you do the same thing with a sacred text, and it's accorded that same level of respect, and so you consign it to a Genizah where you store it, you hide it away from any sort of abuse or any sort of profanation until such time as you can bury it. The problem becomes with the Cairo Genizah, we kind of look back on, we use that as our perfect example of a Genizah, and we look back, but the practice of Genizah has developed over time and changes depending on the Jewish community. So you mentioned the Middle East, but there are many different practices in the Middle East. Two wonderful scholars, Professor Mark Cohen of Princeton and Yedida Stillman, did a fantastic ethnographical study of Genizot in the Middle East. And they interviewed immigrants to Israel from all over the Middle East, and they questioned them on their practices of Genizah. And it turns out that they're very varied. And so some communities only assigned their Torah scrolls and their Sidurim, their Tefillin and things like that to a Genizah, whereas other communities consigned many things to a Genizah, including actual documents, ketubot, divorce documents, the documents of everyday life. And then they stored them in all different places, cupboards under the stairs, between the synagogue walls, in clay pots around the synagogue, they buried them. Sometimes they took them out to the cemetery. It really is a very diverse picture of how Jewish communities interpreted this notion of consigning something to a Genizah. And in fact, that possibly comes from Maimonides in the Middle Ages and his work on in the Mishneh Torah. He extends the discussion of the rabbis in the Talmud to include commentaries, rabbinic commentaries on the law. He says deserve to go in a Genizah as well. And so this extension, this expansion of what could go into a Genizah seems to have stemmed from that period and across the Middle Ages to various communities. The one in Egypt, as we've seen, was perhaps the most extensive in what it held. It seemed to have held all manner of writings. But similarly, Cohen and Stillman also discovered that there there was a case like this in Yemen, in Sana'a, that they also placed in their Genizot many, many different types of documents. I hope that explains.
And as we'll get to discuss more, we'll see. But I just want to explain, I think what makes the Cairo Genizah so fascinating, besides the sheer size and the volume of what's in there, is that we have, like you mentioned, we have everyday, life and divorce documents and school kids, things from school kids. And then we also have Sfarim and the Rambam's own handwriting. And you have many things that are just so varied and so wide. So a question I think that the follow-up before we get, and we'll get into the history right after this, is that, and this is something that you discuss in your introduction of the book, is, so, why does it matter to know how these fragments and the collections got where they are? That we have this one's in Oxford, this one's in Cambridge, and there's the JTS, it came from here, it came through this person, it came through that person. What's the difference if now we have the text, now we have this, like you said, you mentioned Dov Friedrich, we have amazing, that he did, everything's been digitized basically now. You can speak to that and pretty much, and you can now put different fragments together from different parts of the world, and we can, it's just, so why does this really, matter?
I think archaeology matters. You have that where you find something and how you find something tells you a lot about how that thing was used, regarded, discarded. So if we think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it matters to know that some of them were found in clay jars in caves, as opposed to other ones being buried on Masada. That means that they had they were, one is being hidden away and possibly preserved as a storage, possibly to take out again. One is being buried. It's done with. It's being given. Do you see what I mean? So it really is. I think it does matter where you find them, and how you find them. And so the case with the Cairo Genizah, as I hope my book shows, is that there were other materials mixed in there from different places, and so an example is. I think there are many pieces from the Yemenite community that got mixed up in there. And so that added, it wasn't part of the Egyptian community and it wasn't part of their expression of Genizah. And I think you don't appreciate the whole object and its societal context, and if you don't know where it came from and who found it and how it was found. And so getting back to that story is difficult and complex, but I really think we should make the effort to try and do that.
Right. And another thing that, we'll get to this later on, I think is you mentioned that then, is also, this also speaks to the university and the libraries, their collecting practices and how they came to possess these collections and all the questions that raises. So we'll get back to that at the end. I don't want to spoil anything now because we didn't discuss the story, but I think this history does kind of raise those kind of questions. And some of these, just frankly, shady collecting practices, to use like a word, like this, you hear the story. Okay, so let's discuss the book and the history that you did. So first of all, just interestingly, as a general matter, the book is basically told through, not through the eyes of, but kind of through various characters. I guess there are a lot of them with the Genizah. So I don't know if you want to start off there and where you start off in the history of all these various Genizahs and some of the travelers. So I don't know where you want to exactly pick up.
It's a little difficult. It's complex because there are so many characters. There's a massive cast of characters, and I couldn't leave their stories alone. And actually, as I was writing it, more stories came to light. But I really wanted to show these various characters and how they come across how they encounter these fragments and what they do with it, because it's part of this kind of vast network of trade in the late 19th century. And it's part of being able to reconstruct the whole story and know where the fragments came from, is exploring these different characters. And some of them, I was just determined to track them down because some of them come about because of vague references that have sometimes been overlooked. So, for example, we'll talk about them later. The two women explorers, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson. Agnes Lewis, in a publication in the 20th century, mentions in a footnote that a character called Julian Lansing was the first man to extract Genizah materials from Egypt. And that has been the very strangest reference in a book ever, because no one's ever talked about this Julian Lansing. No one knew very much about him or why on earth she was claiming that he was the first to encounter Genizah fragments and bring them out. So I was determined to track down his story. And then when I track down his story, I see their connection to him, and then through him, his connection to other figures and so it it just really snowballed into many figures that were involved in the trade, and it actually goes back to the early 19th century, way before Schechter encounters the collection. But I think in tracing these various figures that are involved before Schechter, we can understand a little bit better what Schechter encountered. And then another part of the story that's always intrigued me is what about after Schechter? Because after Schechter has his famous and wonderful discovery, it's like, okay, case closed, that's it, done. He took everything out, now it's all gone. Well, that wasn't the case at all. There were many thousands of pieces, fragments left there and elsewhere, and they start to make it across to institutions around the world as well. And those stories have not been told in any great depth. And so I wanted to tell. My aim was to tell the before Schechter story and the after Schechter story, and not focus so much on Schechter. But in the end, in the book, I have quite a bit on Schechter as well, and I think they're all very much interwoven.
Yeah. So I think so. Let's start at the beginning. You start off, I think the beginning is with Jacob Saphir in 1864. So this is well before
Right.
Schechter. I don't know if you want to discuss him and his story, and I'll also say for listeners that each one of these figures, you really explain a lot of what they were doing and going around. You kind of get almost a feel of like these travelers to the Middle East also reading the book. It's kind of like almost like their travel log. Here they went here, they were doing this, all different things, different manuscripts and books. It's fascinating story, really. Stories, not a story. So many stories put together. So start off, I guess, at the beginning with Saphir and
Yes, so I start with Saphir because I think it's an important moment in the Genizah story, because there are some misunderstandings about what he did there. But so Jacob Saphir was a Jerusalemite, but originally he came from Lithuania, and he was born there, but he came over with his family to Palestine through a dreadful incident when he was very, very young. His parents are killed. He's then taken in by the Jerusalemite community of Perushim, the outsiders, who are very interested. They are part of the whole Haskalah movement, the Jewish sort of Republic of Letters movement. And he grows up very interested in the whole history of the Masorah, and he becomes. He's then sent by the Perushim to go and raise funds for the Holy Land, and so he's sent on various travels around the Middle East to collect funds. His main purpose is to go over to India, where the great philanthropist David Sassoon is living, and is known as a very great philanthropist and contributor to the Holy Land. So that's his aim. He's going to get to India, but first of all goes through Egypt. And so while he's there in Egypt collecting funds, he's also indulging his curiosity in the history of the Masorah. And so he's wanting to examine some of the Torah scrolls and the ancient books that these synagogues hold. And so he actually records all this and publishes it in a travelogue, which is later published in 1866. But in 1858 and in 1864, he pays 2 visits to the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And in 1864, when he gets there, he encounters that the synagogue has undergone some recent renovations. In the 1860s, Cairo is undergoing many renovations. In fact, it's all part of the leaders' desire to recreate Cairo as a sort of almost in the image of sort of the European great cities. That's Ismail Pasha. And so there are a lot of buildings are being renovated, reconstructed, and the Ben Ezra Synagogue is one of those. And so when Jacob Saphir finds it in 1864, it's in a little bit of disarray because the roof had collapsed in, and then there have been repairs to the roof, but all the repair materials is covering the roof. And from his various visits to the synagogue, he learns that they have a Genizah. And so he wants to see it, and he pays them several visits and begs to see it. They try and stop him from doing so. They're worried that there will be a curse. They try and warn him off that there's a big serpent there in the Genizah, but none of this works. Saphir is very determined. He says he's got sort of an amulet to protect him, and eventually he wins them over to his idea of visiting this Genizah. So it turns out that the Genizah that he visits, he has to go up to the rooftop to see. And the way he describes it is it's a strange description, and it's been rather impenetrable. But it sounds like it was a rooftop box. He says it's got 4 sides. It's closed on all 4 sides. He has a look inside this receptacle, and he spends 2 days rummaging through this Genizah, and he doesn't find anything because he's also hampered by all the roof repairs. But he does wonder, he leaves the scene sort of wondering what else might have been underneath that he wasn't able to get to. Well, when the Cairo Genizah eventually comes to light through Schechter, this Saphir story is used as the first instance of the Genizah itself, the Genizah coming to light. And it's been a source of confusion because many scholars have not thought that the box on the roof was a box on the roof, and that he was actually referring to the great Genizah underneath that's buried in the synagogue walls. There was this huge Genizah, and so I start with him, and I try to pick apart his story. One scholar in Israel, Nehemiah Aloni, once suggested in the 1960s or 70s that it actually was a roof box Genizah, separate from the Genizah that was later discovered. And through my picking the story apart, I've come to kind of, I think, agree with him that this was a Genizah of the synagogue, Ben Ezra Synagogue, and that there were many hiding places in the synagogue that were discovered over time, and Schechter found the biggest of them all. So it's a little bit complicated, and I hope that the readers will get a better sense of it when they read the actual story. But I just sort of picked apart the story and his Hebrew and his use of certain terms to try and get at what it was he saw, so that we can understand the story of what Schechter encountered a little bit better. Anyway, so we start with Saphir. And then at the same time that Jacob Saphir is in the Ben Ezra Synagogue, there's another manuscript hunter over in the Karaite synagogue, Karaite Genizah, and his name is Abraham Firkovich. And his activities are also are known. I'm not the first to talk about this by any means, but what I try to do with Firkovich is show a little bit more of how he came to be interested in trying to locate Genizot. He was trying to rebuild the history of the Karaites. At times, this led him to a little bit of, he was sometimes engaged in forgeries in order to prove this history. Quite a character, but he was somebody who really brought to light some amazing manuscripts. One of the richest collection of Hebrew manuscripts in the world is extant thanks to his activities. But then he was also, some of the ways he went around collecting Genizah manuscripts are a little bit, well, not necessarily to be admired. And I think I wanted to tell his story also because it tells us about what methods the manuscript hunters used to sort of wrest these Genizah fragments away from communities. And in Firkovich's case, he used two methods in particular. One was he would promise communities funding help to sort of rebuild any of their dilapidated synagogues in exchange for their manuscripts. And then another method was he would offer them new, shiny, printed editions of important texts in exchange for their old, discarded, who else would want them, pieces of fragments. So he's another, he tells us a lot about how these manuscripts first encountered Genizot, how they went about collecting them.
Something that you point out when you discuss, so when you know, woven through the Saphir and Firkovich story, you talk about what we discussed in the beginning, history of Genizahs, where they were, you know, how they buried them. But something else I think we didn't mention that you do mention at this point, so I think in the book, so I'll bring it up here, is, you know, how often were they emptied and then buried? You know, they'd have these Genizahs in the synagogue, in the shul, in between the walls or in the basement, wherever, and they would take it out and empty, and that plays obviously a part in the Cairo Genizah, the Ben Ezra Synagogue. So how often did that occur?
Right. Well, I don't think there's any one that we know that there's I think that the traditional idea was it would be something like a period of 7 years, and 7 or 8 years. And we get that from some of the practices we read about in Jerusalem. We have eyewitness accounts of material being taken out and buried in Genizot in Jerusalem in the 19th century. And it's accompanied by an amazing procession, and it's a whole sort of, the burying of the Genizah is a festival. And one of the eyewitnesses says, and this was done every 8 years. And there are other places where we see recorded the idea that you would periodically empty the Genizah, and possibly on a basis of every 7 years. But this is not really, there's no uniformity to this, it seems. And again, going back to the Cohen and Stillman article, you can see that that's certainly true, because there are communities who report that they regularly buried their material, and then there are communities that never did. And so Firkovich, he encounters 2 synagogues in the Crimea where the material has been buried there for centuries, sort of buried in situ. And so I think in some communities, the Genizah within the synagogue becomes its own place of burial. And I think that's also what's happened in the Ben Ezra Synagogue, in that within the walls of the Ben Ezra Synagogue, at one point, it becomes really kind of buried in situ. And I'm just looking back at my notes on the Cohen article. I think, oh yes, it was in Yemen. They found that they would store them in various places. And then when the storage place became filled, then they would move it to a new storage place. And it would move from storage place to storage place until they entirely ran out of storage places. Then in Yemen, they would put them in pots, and then they would bury them. And the one witness says that was a period of every 200 years. So you can see it really does differ across the communities of the Near East as to how often they did this, or if they even did it at all.
Okay, so this part of the story, that then there's you know, we mentioned Firkovich in passing, but you know, the book has you know, there's quite a lot on written about him that you write about. So that's, you do, I should mention also a lot of the chapters you mentioned, like the chapter title, and also you mentioned the years in a chronological order. So that was in the 1860s. We get to the 1870s. So you have a figure here that I think we'll get to more later, but Greville John Chester, and then you also. He's a figure, and with him, you discuss something that I guess we should mention. I guess this is kind of one of the famous things about the Ben Ezra Synagogue, is this, why is it called that, is this scroll, the Torah of Ezra, and so this legend. So talk a little bit about him now, right, and how much you want to get to him later, and this legend.
Chester is an important figure because he's actually the first person to see the Genizah in the synagogue walls come to light. In 1889, the Ben Ezra Synagogue was renovated. As far as we can tell, it was brought down to its foundations and completely rebuilt anew from the foundation up, a replica of the former building, but completely a new building. And at that point, all the manuscript fragments that have been buried in the Genizah wall, in the synagogue walls, come to light. And Chester's actually one of the very first people to witness that. Greville Chester was a clergyman from Sheffield, from England. He enjoyed collecting things in his youth. He wanted his main occupation to be in the church, but he had ill health, and through traveling to the Near East for health reasons, he caught the bug. He caught the collecting bug, and he became a real collector of note. And there are thousands of objects in the British Museum and in the Fitzwilliam Museum and in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford that are there thanks to him. Many, many pieces of Egyptology. He traveled there for decades, and he became an expert in the region. He also became he was an explorer. He traveled to parts of Egypt that other people hadn't been to. So he really is a very fascinating character. But one of the things he does also is to follow in the footsteps of earlier manuscript hunters who are looking for ancient copies of Syriac manuscripts hidden in monasteries. And in a sort of analogous way to the Genizah, some of these monasteries had sort of cellar-like rooms or basements where they would hide away many older copies of their texts. And he was very keen to find these, and one of his explorations is around the monasteries in Egypt, looking for these manuscripts. And while he's doing that, he also goes to the Ben Ezra Synagogue and has a look in there. And we have a very helpful description by him of the synagogue, the medieval building before it's renovated. He described it very thoroughly, what it looked like, and he even provides measurements. What he failed to notice on his first visit was something that many people had been going there to see, and that was this so-called scroll of Ezra. And this was purportedly an ancient Torah scroll in the hand of the prophet Ezra that it first sort of comes to light in medieval writings. Among the early writings is Rabbi Bertinoro of Italy. He travels to the Near East, actually becomes a rabbi in Jerusalem. He visits the synagogue and he describes this scroll and the many legends surrounding it, and the fact that it has since disappeared, and that it was taken on board a ship and the ship sunk. And then there are other subsequent visitors who claim to actually have seen it. So there are conflicting eyewitness reports throughout, sort of from the Middle Ages through to the modern period, of people who claim it's gone missing, and people who claim they've seen it. But whatever. Any visitor to what it becomes then is a little bit of a tourist attraction, and so does bring visitors to the Ben Ezra Synagogue, and that's really what they want to see. And there's no mention of Genizot until very late in the day. So there they are. They're coming to see the so-called scroll of Ezra, or a very old scroll, meanwhile, hidden within that synagogue wall are hundreds of thousands of medieval manuscript that no one's aware of, because their focus is on this legendary scroll. And so many of the stories that I cover are some of these manuscript hunters who pay these sort of clandestine visits to the synagogue to try and wrest this precious scroll away from the synagogue and bring it into the light of day. And so those are some of the adventures that I talk about.
And I'm sure, so I said, we'll get back to Chester. And I will mention also that there are a lot of other, I guess, call them minor figures, whatever, but there are other figures throughout that we are just, you'll have to read the book to get. And these stories that we discussed, there's a lot more specific stories that are mentioned in the book that we just can't cover in the podcast. Well,
right.
As well as we also skipped over someone I'm sure we'll get to shortly, is Adolf Neubauer from Oxford. We did not discuss him, but we'll get to that. So the next figure in the 1880s that you mentioned is a really interesting one. You call him Moses Shapira, or as a Jewish, he converted to Christianity.
Yes.
And he was like, so talk about him and his story and how he relates to the Genizah.
He's a fascinating character, and I confess that I dismissed him for many years. So there were scholars talking about the discovery of the Genizah, and they talked about Moses Shapira as being one of the first to discover the Genizah. And I dismissed this because to my mind, it was in an impenetrable place, and I didn't see any evidence of that. And in his collections, which are largely Karaite, to my mind, pointed to the fact that he probably visited the Karaite Genizah, but not the Ben Ezra Synagogue Genizah. So I wasn't terribly interested in Shapira until I was working on the book in the very early stages, and a scholar called Idan Dershowitz connected with me and very kindly shared with me Shapira's catalog, which is now in the Berlin State Library. And in this catalog is one page, and it says from Genizah of Cairo. And Shapira lists all the Torah scrolls that he's lifted from these Genizahs of Cairo. And then at the very bottom, he's got one mention of a very old Torah scroll, so-called scroll of Ezra from the old synagogue in Cairo, showing that he too was somebody who had been to visit this so-called Ezra scroll and even tried to take pieces of it. Anyway, so that was okay. Now I'm interested in Moses Shapira. So I do some researching of his story. Shapira was, yes, he was born to an Orthodox Jewish family. Shapira travels with his grandfather to try and track down his father. And en route, sadly, his grandfather dies and Shapira is all alone. He gets taken in and given help by some missionaries. And of course, he then converts to Christianity. He adopts the new name Moses Wilhelm Shapira and ends up in Palestine, where eventually he opens an antiquities store, and he becomes famous and notorious all at the same time. His store is visited by many collectors because he's got all sorts of things. In the front, he's got books and curios, and in the back, he's got all the good stuff. But in addition to this, he gets involved in some very dodgy dealings, including fake Moabitica, that's sort of statues and things supposedly ancient from Moab, statues that become revealed as forgeries. Then he develops, realizes that it's a better route to take is as serious bookseller, and he takes several trips to Yemen, where he also encounters a Yemenite Jewish guide called Habshush, and Habshush takes Shapira around and helps him discover manuscripts, actually in this case not fragments, actual codices, actual books and scrolls in synagogues in Yemen, and also buried in Jewish cemeteries. And Shapira comes back with this massive haul and starts to sell it to some of the major museums and libraries in Europe. They're not buying these Yemenite pieces wholesale, because some of them they've never encountered before. They're a little bit they're suspicious of him. They're suspicious of them. They're not sure how to date them. So he doesn't he does sell Yemenite materials, but not as well as what he then subsequently goes into, which is dealing in Karaite materials. And so he becomes very close to a figure in the Karaite community in Egypt, Moses Livy, and through him is able to acquire many manuscripts from their actual library, but also from their Genizah. So that's Moses Shapira, and so there. I think his story is important because he also connects to people who are interested in buying his wares, and those people are connected to subsequent Genizah collectors, and the fact that he's dealing with the Yemenite community, and the Yemenites. Eventually, many immigrants come to Jerusalem, bringing their manuscripts with them, and many of these manuscripts, so they get sold off in parts, and they get fed into this whole market and trade for manuscripts and eventually for fragments, and it becomes rather complicated as to provenance. So I think he's a pivotal figure in that.
Right, and that's, I mean, a lot of the stories are, like I said, about the Cairo Genizah, and we'll again get that in quotes, and we'll get to that later. But and then just in general about Genizot, and
Right.
and the whole manuscript hunting going on in the area. So, and in general in the world. So the next figure is another interesting one, is Abraham from Harkavy.
Right.
Harkavy. Maybe I'm not pronouncing his name right. Yeah.
Do you know, I don't ever say it correctly. I think I say Harkavy, but I don't think it's probably Harkavy. I'm not sure. Depends where you're coming from. I suppose if you're a Russian Jew, you might say it one way, and if you're, you've got that sort of Sephardi Hebrew, you'll say it another way. Anyway, Harkavy was a Russian Jewish scholar, prodigious scholar, produced hundreds of scholarly works. He was also the bibliographer for the Russian Imperial Library, and he was the one who actually got to catalogue Firkovich's Genizah collections, and another subsequent collection. So he was the cataloguer for the Imperial Russian Library, and an incredible expert on manuscripts, and was even able to uncover where some of Firkovich's very clever forgeries. Harkavy himself traveled to the Near East on a manuscript collecting mission, and he produces a book where he talks about the materials he discovered. As I said in the book, it's a little bit frustrating because it's a very sort of dry. If you're looking for clues as to what he did and where he did it, you're not going to find it in his book. It's a very, very scholarly sort of description and list of what he uncovered. But he mentions having gone into Genizot in Egypt, in Jerusalem, and we know that he actually acquired his own Genizah collection, a very small collection that ended up in the Verdansky Library in Kiev, went through various hands, but we have no idea where he got it. So part of trying to get back to where they came from is this whole joining and matching of fragments that Genizah scholars are doing today can help us know where things might have come from. But he's very interesting in that he gives us some clues. So, for example, one major Genizah collection held in the Russian Library is the Antonin collection, the Archimandrite Antonin, who collected one of the first collections to come out of the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And it's a substantial collection because it's less fragmentary than other collections. There are more book-like pieces. So it's very interesting. And so people have speculated that Antonin was there on the ground, selecting nice pieces from amongst the massive pile of things that emerged from this Genizah. But some people have thought, well, maybe he did this actually prior to the Ben Ezra Synagogue being renovated. Perhaps he went into the Genizah itself and pulled out these great pieces. But I think that Harkavy's visit to him and what Harkavy describes in his book shows that no, Antonin did not have Genizah material at that period. He had collected many Hebrew manuscripts, but not Genizah material, because Harkavy does not mention it and does not describe it. So it seems like it's a slightly later thing. So it's just really trying to pick up at all these stories to try and get back to who knew what, who found what, when they found it, what they had. And it's a little complex.
And that's, that's throughout the book. Like I said, again, just to reiterate, all the stories, all the figures. I mean, it's just a real fascinating book, putting together all these stories in different parts. I mean, you see how many manuscript hunting was going on, and manuscript hunters were running around, and also clearly how many stuff was flying around, and people were just buying it. You mentioned Shapira before. You talk about how what's his name? I think Yichya Kafech, right? Kafech. He talks about how he just basically like ripped off. He stole them, but it. He got them for very cheap, and people were just either stealing or getting them for very cheap and just walking off with the stuff. There was just like it was like I don't know. It sounds like a manuscript Wild West. I don't know what was going on. All manner of things going on in at this time period.
Absolutely, and it's kind of a little sad for the community, because at that point, and now we look back and we can see how rich and enriching these collections were. But at the time, I think, they were probably perhaps handing away their treasures a little too easily, and not perhaps totally realizing their significance. But there were many manuscript hunters on the trail.
Another famous one that you talk about after is Elkan Nathan Adler, who his father, I think was what his father was.
Nathan Adler.
Nathan Adler, the chief rabbi of England, who listeners may be familiar as the author of Nisina Lager. He wrote a book on Onkelos and Targum. So he was another very famous collector. I think, and I'll just mention his collection is at JTS mainly, right? Is that true?
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So he was another figure that you discussed. So maybe talk about
I love Elkan Nathan Adler. He's one of my favorites, and I'm thinking also about exploring his whole story in depth for another book, possibly. Fascinating, a true bibliophile, actually addicted to collecting. And whereas other collectors were perhaps discerning in that they would, if they got a pile of fragments, they might pick and choose. Adler was not. He was scooping it all up. And had this massive library in his home over time. He goes to Palestine at an early stage. He's sent there as part of his work for the Anglo-Jewish Committee, and on behalf of Moses Montefiore, to sort out some difficulties with his estates there in Palestine. Elkan Adler is a lawyer by profession, so he goes to help with that. And somehow, we don't know exactly what, but he encounters manuscripts. And he's hooked, and he's also entranced by what he sees in his travels around the Near East. He visits Egypt. He's because his father is the chief rabbi of England, he's invited to all the sort of homes of the leading Egyptian families, and he's taken around and given a tour of Ben Ezra Synagogue, and he's given a tour of the Basatine Cemetery, the ancient cemetery in Cairo, and many other places. And he just becomes enamored with this whole place, and he builds many networks and friendships with the people he encounters. But he's kind of famously having been to the Ben Ezra Synagogue and asked about their manuscripts, he famously declares that there are no manuscripts of worth to be discovered in Cairo, little knowing that later he's going to actually encounter an amazing cache of manuscripts. But in between that visit in 1888 and then his subsequent visit in 1896, where he does encounter the Genizah, he travels around other countries in the Middle East. He goes to Morocco and Algeria, and part of this is his, as I say, it's his work for the Anglo-Jewish Committee, where he's helping with Jewish educational activities in these countries. But while he's there, he's visiting homes, he's visiting synagogues, and he's asking about their manuscripts. He also establishes a very important friendship with a scholar over in Budapest, which is David Kaufman. And on his way home from his visit to the Near East in 1888, he stops off at David Kaufman's home. And David Kaufman is a private collector as well. And in his home, he's amassing this incredible collection of Hebrew manuscripts. And Adler very interestingly talks about how he intended to stop by at Kaufman's and have a conversation with him and then go to the opera, but he never gets to the opera because the whole night is spent just looking at David Kaufman's collection. And I think this also feeds into Adler's own desires to build such a collection himself. So I don't know. Do you want me to carry on with Adler?
I mean, we can talk a lot about Adler. There's a couple of other figures that we should get to. So now there's a couple other ones that I don't know where you want to go, because you mentioned Count de Ulst, if I'm pronouncing his name correct. I don't know. The Holst, Neubauer, and then there's, because here you try to, again, we're on the lead up to Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson and Solomon Schechter. So before this, you have them. You also have Wertheimer. We mentioned, and then Chester again. Chester plays a big part again. There's another two chapters at Chester. So I don't know which of those figures you want to talk about.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, no, I know
they all pop in and out because I did want to try and tell this in a chronological way, and I really wanted to show how one figure affects or influences the other. I think the connections are very important. The networks they build, part of the ways that they acquire these manuscripts and these fragments is through these networks. And so I thought it was very important to weave these stories together. So you'll find characters that come in at one point in the story and then they arise again later. One character who goes through most of the story is this mysterious Count Riamo Dulst. We don't know if he's Austrian, German, what he is. All we know is that he appears on the scene, the Egyptological scene, working for the Egypt Exploration Fund in the 1880s. He's hired to be an excavator on many of their important digs, particularly the one at Tel Basta. And he's apparently, by this time, he's fluent in Arabic. And they rely on him very much to negotiate all of the movement of monuments, etc., with the locals who are hired to work there. He's very much trusted by the Egypt Exploration Fund, to the extent that when they decide to start going looking for Fatimid pottery in the rubbish mounds of Cairo, they hire him to do this excavation work. And so while he's digging for Fatimid pottery, he has this serendipitous discovery of Hebrew manuscripts buried in either these rubbish mounds or near where he's digging, which is in the environs of the fortress of Babylon, that whole area where the Ben Ezra Synagogue is. And so he finds these Hebrew fragments and he mails them off to the Egypt Exploration Fund, asking for instructions about what to do with them and what to do with the rest that he's found. And he never gets any instructions back. those get passed on to the Bodleian in Oxford, where they subsequently become known as a collection that came to Oxford through the Exploration Fund, and there's never any mention of him. He sort of disappears from that part of that story. He arises again later, helping Oxford to find the source of these fragments. So he appears in the story in 1893, and then again in 1895, 1896. And then he's one of the figures in the after Schechter story, also involved in some secret operations for the Bodleian to excavate and find more fragments. So he's a character that runs all the way through it. He's kind of important because what he discovers underground, I think, forms quite a lot of what Schechter finds eventually in the newly reconstructed synagogue. So it's a complex story that I try and pick apart and I try and tell chronologically, but there's still so many parts actually that I haven't been able to uncover and that we may never know or may arise one day. Anyway, so he's one of the main figures. What happened was eventually, when the Bodleian finally catalogued its wonderful Genizah collection, he totally gets left out of the picture. Something that he complains about in 1910. He says, "Hey, where am I in this catalogue?" And they actually have to republish the catalogue with an apology for leaving him out. But they don't acknowledge his early work. They only acknowledge his work to excavate post-Schechter. And it's a whole crazy story. But he's somebody that I discovered very early on when I was first researching the various stories. And I think he's actually quite pivotal to the whole thing.
Yes, as listeners probably can tell, the book, so the way, like you said, it's chronological with these stories woven in. So it's like almost told, not, like I said, not through the vantage point of a particular person, but almost there's like, and again, each chapter, even if there's a main figure, there's a lot of minor figures, stories interwoven, but as it, it's pushing, the whole book is chronological. So I know we're kind of discussing the main figures and trying to discuss the stories, but I mean, like I said, really the best place ever to read the book, but that's how it's kind of coming across. I mean, so we mentioned there's so many figures here, but I said Wertheimer, he was a big collector and seller, and then Neubauer, and then Chester again. I mean, Chester, I think, seems to play an integral role of the Genizah, like you had mentioned already before, that he got there. I don't know if you want to talk about it a little bit more, when they renovated the Ezra Synagogue, and this is really when, I guess, the Cairo Genizah starts to be discovered and the wheels start turning, so to speak. It seems like.
I think this is such an important moment. So it's 1889. The Ben Ezra Synagogue is in a bad state of disrepair, and so the community, as far as we can tell from things that emerge later, decided to pull the whole synagogue down to its foundations and rebuild it. And this was also done to another synagogue in a town in Egypt called Machala al-Kubra, and there they did the very same thing. That the building just could not be renovated anymore, and so bring it down and then build it up. And what they would try to do is exact replicas, because they knew they had a historic building, and the feeling was if you replicated it exactly, you weren't really destroying it in any way. So what they do is, they bring it down, and Chester is there really probably when it's sort of almost down to the ground. It's a little bit hard to tell from his testimony, but he's there in December 1889. And he rushes off a letter to the Bodleian Library to tell them that he's encountered this room and the floor is covered with fragments. And he got some of them and he sent them off. But he's very anxious about the rest, and he can't get the community to say what they're going to do with the rest. And so you can understand from this testimony that possibly the community themselves weren't expecting this. They brought the synagogue down. Now hidden within their walls is this large collection of fragments, medieval fragments, and they've no idea what to do with it. And from later testimony, it seems that they were placed in sacks in the courtyard where they stood for weeks until they made a decision about what to do with them. But so Chester's first discovery of them, first encounter with them, and his testimony is very important. And then what happens afterwards, because of this, because of what he sends to Oxford, is so interesting and so important, because it's important medieval fragments. It seems that when he returned to England, they must have had a meeting with him and instructed him, when you go back on your next visit to Egypt, go back there, find those fragments. And so he does. What we don't know, though, is exactly what he did. We know, we have his letters. We have letters over the course of 2 years after that, where he's sending fragments back in sort of batches, and he's sending letters with them. And we can tell from the letters that he's getting them from a dealer. And we know from the collection that he sent to Oxford that it was a very good collection, in that, again, it wasn't as fragmentary as the sort of manuscripts that Schechter would encounter. Not so many tiny pieces, more substantial pieces. So we don't know whether there was a dealer on the ground sort of hand picking, or exactly what the story was, but that is the suspicion. And I try in the book to, looking at some of the known dealers of the period, try to see who might have been his middleman. I mean, I'm not able to draw any firm conclusions on that, but I offer up some ideas. But his testimony about what was coming out, what was there, and is very important. And then finally, Chester succumbs to the flu in 1892. So that 1892 he dies, but before then, his last visit to the Ben Ezra Synagogue, he sees the completed building, the new replica, and he's horrified. He has his own terrible biases. He regards the synagogue as a desecrated former church. He's completely wrong in that, but he's quite biased against the community and what they've done, and he's horrified. And he sends an article to one of the leading English journals decrying this, and that helps us know when the end point of when the Ben Ezra Synagogue was rebuilt. So he plays an important role in telling us when the manuscripts came to light, what was available and how it was available, and then when it gets closed off again and disappears. Because after that point, the person on the receiving end of Chester's manuscripts, who is Adolf Neubauer, the curator, sub-librarian in Oxford, is rather upset, I suppose, that this wonderful sort of train of manuscripts coming his way has now come to an end now that Chester's died, and he's keen to find the source of the fragments and get them for Oxford. So he asks his good friend in Oxford, the Assyriologist scholar called Archibald Henry Sayce, to help him trace the fragments. And that's where the Count Dulst comes in again, because Sayce goes to Dulst to help him trace the fragments. And so he becomes involved in the story at that point. And it's also where another unsung sort of character in the story, Solomon Aaron Wertheimer, comes in, because while Neubauer over in Oxford is busy worrying that this wonderful supply's come to an end, suddenly on his desk a supply appears, and it appears from Jerusalem through this scholar, Solomon Aaron Wertheimer. Wertheimer is a rather sad figure, because his family, he was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He's kind of like Saphir. They come over to Jerusalem, and he's orphaned at an early age. But he studies in the Sephardi Yeshivot in Jerusalem, becomes fascinated with Jewish texts and ancient Jewish texts and manuscripts, and wants to publish his own scholarly editions of some of the manuscripts he's coming across in the yeshiva and also through dealers. And he wants to be able to sell his scholarly publications and become a known scholar. So he reaches out to institutions in Europe, essentially, first of all, Oxford and Neubauer. And he sends Neubauer some fragments that have come his way, that he's forced to sell because it's the only way to finance his scholarly work. The only way to finance the printing of his publications is to start selling off the pieces that he's actually working on. So as he's working on them, after he's worked on them and he's published them, he sells them on, which also upsets Neubauer a little bit later when he discovers that some of these pieces have already been published by Wertheimer. Anyway, Wertheimer has many struggles. It seems that he was put in touch with Cambridge University and Solomon Schechter, and he starts to try to sell to Cambridge, and he has many struggles in his manuscript selling profession because he doesn't receive payments. He has to wait a long time for payments. He doesn't receive much sort of recognition for what he's selling either. So he's a rather unsung character who later in life kind of lamented the fact that others got the glory of the discovery of the Genizah, where he was selling these fragments from an early period that come to him in Jerusalem. But he's important as well because I would say that he's part of this whole mix-up of materials, because we can see from his sales to Oxford that it wasn't just Genizah fragments that he was selling other manuscripts as well. And some of the things he sold to Oxford become described as Genizah that are not in fact Genizah. And so he's part of this whole... Because we don't know his sources, we can't say for sure that they came from the Ben Ezra Synagogue, all of them. Sorry, that was a long way round of
it's great. It's great. And I think what's so fascinating about the book and the conversation is that, not to downplay Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson and Solomon Schechter, obviously, but there are so many other figures and so many years before in other parts of the story that just haven't been told. Nobody knows about it. It's just like, this is the Solomon Schechter and the sisters, and it's their Genizah, and it's as if like, and there's all these other figures and all these other collections and all these other parts that really comes through in the book. So, I mean, we should, like you said, we're talking about the Cairo Genizah, we should mention them: Agnes, Smith, Lewis, and Margaret, Dunlop, Gibson, right? So, I mean, it's interesting how they came to be viewed as the discoverers. Clearly that is not the case, but that's how it's like known as today. And then Solomon Schechter, who I guess, well, Schechter did, I guess, kind of bring the main bulk of the Genizah, so to speak, in Cambridge. So I guess that's why. But how did the sisters come to be viewed as like the discoverers? And talk about them a little, and then we'll get a little bit to Schechter. I guess we have to.
Right. Absolutely. But I mean, I want to say first of all that I would hate to claim myself as the first person to ever speak about any of these other characters. They have been spoken about before. They're partly explored in a wonderful book called Sacred Trash by Dina Hoffman and Peter Cole, and in many other places as well. The only thing that tends to happen is no one's really looked at the other characters in any great detail, and they often get sidelined for the major stories surrounding the two sisters and Schechter. And I think part of that is the problem I faced in writing this book. Maybe the problem, I hope it isn't a problem, maybe the reader will encounter this, is there are lots of stories, and it how to keep it compelling when you've got so many different things going on. If you want to tell anyone who ever asked me about the Cairo Genizah, what is it, what do you do, I tell the story of Solomon Schechter because it's so compelling and it's so easy to tell. It's a great story, and you know, so a synagogue held within it for 1,000 years. The whole cache of manuscripts was discovered by this amazing character, brought to England. It's really an easier story to tell in a nutshell than the whole scope of the story, if you see what I mean. So I think that's how we've got to this situation where some of these characters have been underexplored rather than ignored. But Lewis and Gibson, they have been sort of given this sort of glory of the discoverers. At the same time, they too were a little unsung, because they're often in the story presented as sort of the conduit. They're the ones who bring the great manuscript that leads Schechter to go on this mission to uncover the Genizah, the Ben Ezra. They're the ones who discover this Ben Ezra piece. They hand it to Schechter, and there the story surrounds Schechter. But because the discovery of Ben Sira, this fragment of Ben Sira, was so important, so pivotal to Schechter's great discovery, that they too now are appended to this story. So it's often told that it starts with them. They find the Ben Sira, they bring the Ben Sira home in their sack of fragments, they give it to Schechter, and then Schechter goes on this expedition to Cairo. So that's how they have become sort of key figures in this story. But the story does ignore their own scholarship, their own other discoveries of manuscripts, their amazing abilities in language. They're self-taught Arabic, Syriac, Hebrew, Greek, or many other languages that they acquired and were able to decipher manuscripts themselves and publish manuscripts themselves. So two extraordinary women and amazing characters themselves. And in fact, I wanted to show more of their story, and some of that went on the cutting room floor, because I also had to make sure I didn't go too much over the limit that I was given by the publisher. So some of their story does not make it in. But I think I veered off track from what you asked me.
so how did they? But how did they? I mean, do you know? Like you're saying, they definitely were unsung in some regard, but in some regard they are considered. I'm not to downplay what they did. I'm just saying, how did they come to be viewed as the discoverer? Like, how did they get that position, even if it's just as a conduit, like you said? But I'm curious, how did that come about? And also, just talk a little bit about that. I mean, you just did, but you mentioned the Ben Sira story. Maybe that pertains to Schechter. Maybe listeners aren't familiar. You could say that story as well.
Yeah, that's the essential piece. So they, as I said, they were explorers and discoverers in their own right, discovered important manuscripts in St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, and they were very connected to various dealers in the area. And in the spring of 1896, they hear rumors there are some very interesting fragments, manuscripts for sale in the markets of Cairo. And so with these rumors, they decide to take off and go and see what they can get. And the rumors must have been very good, because cholera is raging through Egypt at this point, and you don't really want to go and visit Egypt while there's a cholera epidemic, but they do. So they must have heard that there was some good stuff to be had, and so what they do is they seem to have acquired some manuscripts in Cairo, although they didn't stay there for very long. So it's quite a mystery how they managed that. Then they go over to Jerusalem and stay there, where they acquire some more Hebrew manuscripts, and they come home to England with a couple of sacks of manuscripts. They're going through them, looking at them, and there's some that they can decipher themselves because they do know classical Hebrew. They've taught themselves classical Hebrew, but they come across a piece that is they can't read because it's not in the Hebrew they know. So they happened to be good friends with Solomon Schechter and his wife. Solomon Schechter was a reader in rabbinics at Cambridge, but also a little bit of an outsider because he was a Jew. And they too were sort of on the outside of the main sort of scholarly life of Cambridge. And it seems that Schechter sort of brought into his world some of those other outsiders. And so they knew one another. They met often. And it does seem that actually Schechter asked the two the two sisters about their travels and ask them to be on the lookout for Hebrew manuscripts. So when they come home and they're going through and they encounter this piece that they can't recognize, they ask him to take a look at it, and he does, and it's this amazing moment where he's so excited because what he's got in his hand is a medieval copy of the Book of Ben Sira. Well, a couple of pages of the medieval copy of the Book of Ben Sira. And this is huge because Schechter had been doing a lot of scholarship on Ben Sira for many years. And give you a bit of listeners a bit of background about Ben Sira. It was a book, sort of a book of wisdom literature created in the 300 around 300 BCE by Yeshua Ben Sira. It was his sort of book of Proverbs, a bit like the book of Proverbs. It then got translated into Greek by his grandson, and only the Greek version survived. The original Hebrew that it was written in, that text disappeared. And eventually the Greek text became adopted by the church, became part of the church canon, part of the books of the Apocrypha, and the only surviving examples of the original Hebrew are to be found in rabbinic literature, where it's quoted. Schechter, being a prodigious scholar of rabbinic literature, sort of knew Ben Sira as it stood within the rabbinic literature back to front. And he had spent years going through all the rabbinic works to extract all of these pieces of Ben Sira, because his argument was that it was originally written in Hebrew. And it was a little bit, it also concerns a little bit of a battle with the scholars of the School of Higher Criticism, the School of Biblical Criticism, who at the time were, Schechter called them scholars of the School of Higher Anti-Semitism. And at the same time, they were trying to work out the chronology of the books of the Bible and the history of the Bible. They also sort of categorized rabbinic literature as somewhat sort of a fallen Judaism. There was the Judaism of the Israelites and the early period and this sort of fallen period, and that Hebrew, post-biblical Hebrew, somehow becomes less sort of somewhat bastardized. It's not as to be as revered as classical Hebrew, and there's discussions around the dating of post-biblical Hebrew as well. Anyway, so this is a whole battle that Schechter and Neubauer are engaged in, and they're publishing quotations of Ben Sira to try and counter many of these arguments. And so it's very serendipitous that the sisters bring him this medieval fragment that contains that is a copy of the original Hebrew. And the way that Schechter knows that is he's so familiar with the Hebrew. It's an amazing moment and a legendary moment, and one that we've spoken about many, many times in the whole Cairo Genizah world. And it's at this point that Schechter realizes that there's something. There's a source in Cairo, in Egypt. And if that kind of fragment can come to light, then there must be other great treasures to be found as well. And not only that, since it's only a couple of pages of Ben Sira, he wants to find the rest. And so this puts in motion a whole expedition that he puts together to go to Cairo to discover the source. Again, another long way around to telling this story. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. Listen, that's the story, and it's even longer. Schechter. So Solomon Schechter, first of all, said he was in Cambridge. People may be familiar. He ended up coming to JTS, and he was then of conservative Judaism. Right. So people may be familiar with him, but he. I don't know how much else we want to talk about Schechter. I mean, obviously, he was introduced, like you ended off just your answer there. He ended up going to Cairo. He brought back, I mean, how many fragments did he bring back? I mean, so the main thing is Schechter, before we get to post-Schechter, is that he really brought back most of, like you said, most of the Cairo Genizah. I really should address that shortly, but most of the Cairo Genizah he brings back with him, and he just empties out the Ezra Synagogue, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, what I tried to show with my Schechter chapters is there are a few more details about the story that haven't been examined in any great detail, and that is many keys he was given to to make connections in Cairo, important connections, and some of the other places he's visited, and some of the other ways he got fragments, not just from the Ben Ezra Synagogue, although definitely he got the bulk of his material from the Ben Ezra Synagogue. But there were other materials thrown in, materials that he got from the Basatine Cemetery, from visits to other synagogues in Genizot, including probably the Cairo Genizah, that he doesn't talk about, but that we can get to through some of his letters and correspondence. And then there is the issue of how much, because when he comes home and he describes this amazing venture in this wonderful article for the Times newspaper called A Hoard of Hebrew Manuscripts. He talks about having brought 40,000 pieces back to England. And in fact, when you start to look at the story closely and pick it apart, you can see that it was in that region. It maybe somewhere between 40 and 60,000, maybe 80,000, but it wasn't. The story is often told that Schechter brought back 140,000 fragments, and that is not the case. It's more like he said it was when he first mentioned it. What happened subsequently is that he started buying from dealers as well when he got back to Cambridge. And in addition to that, he was sent over several sacks of materials from a connection that he had in Cairo, who was on the ground and recovering fragments from some of these excavations that were taking place by the Count Dalst. So Schechter acquires material subsequent to his visit to Cairo, and that hasn't often been factored into the story. So today the collection stands at over 190,000 fragments, but that wasn't originally what Schechter brought out of Cairo. And so that's where we need to question sometimes how much of this collection actually came from the Ben Ezra Synagogue, or how much of it came from other places in Cairo, in Egypt, but also Jerusalem and elsewhere.
So you're saying basically there's even a Schechter after Schechter kind of.
There is.
It's not just a one-time. So now let's talk about. We also should mention his move to America and JTS, because JTS, we mentioned Elkan Nathan Adler, and they also have a pretty big, just general big, massive collection of Svarim and manuscripts, but it also Cairo Genizah. But even before that, I mean, you had mentioned before, I don't know if you want to mention more about post Schechter. So after Schechter takes out this Genizah, I mean, there's still more stuff, and that speaks. And so who are those figures, and what are we talking about? How much are we talking about? What are we talking about?
Right. At the same time, running alongside the Schechter story is the Neubauer story, because Neubauer has been collecting these fragments since Chester first found them. And Wertheimer has sent him fragments. And so Neubauer has been invested in this recovery of fragments from a very early period and all the way through. And then suddenly Schechter makes this great Ben Sira discovery, and Neubauer has been a little bit pipped to the post. And so Neubauer goes through his collections and also finds some pages of Ben Sira. He announces it in the press. There's a whole upset because Schechter feels like he's been subjected to one-upmanship, and it does cause a rift between the two. So then what happens is Neubauer is then now secretly trying to recover the fragments himself, and he's got his agent on the ground, who is the Count Dalst, who's watching over what's happening there. Schechter comes in and swoops away the bulk that Schechter takes, but his Neubauer's agent informs him that there's plenty still left behind. There's stuff that was originally taken out and buried. There may even have been things buried from an earlier period. It's not clear. But at any rate, there is buried material, and Neubauer is very interested in this. The Count sends him some samples, and the Bodleian funds an excavation. And so what comes to light in those excavations is an unknown amount of material. All we can get at is the fact that through his correspondence, the Count reveals that he sent 16 sacks, large sacks, to Oxford. So we can imagine that that's quite a number of fragments, that tiny pieces of paper shoved into a sack. That's quite a large number. What happens is Neubauer was trying to build sort of a world-class collection. The Bodleian collection is superb, and it's thanks to him in large part. So he wasn't able to, and possibly not interested in, collecting every tiny little fragment. He wanted to collect the important pieces, so he did pick and choose. And so what the Count sent him, really he regarded as the sort of there were no gems in there, very few, and so most of it they decided to sell off again. So they sell it off, and they call it it's in the ledgers, it's called a sale of waste. And who buys it? Well, it's Elkan Adler. Elkan Adler buys this sale of waste. And so this material that was excavated by Dalst becomes part of Elkan Adler's collection, private collection. And it's so difficult to get back at the numbers, but we can only imagine possibly in the tens of thousands of pieces. Then we have people like the scholar Israel Abrams visiting Cairo after Schechter. He writes some private letters to his wife saying things like, "Oh, it's a real steal," Schechter pretending that he took everything. There's still a great deal there to be found. So he encounters a great deal, but doesn't take anything. He has a very small collection. We don't know, possibly that he got while visiting, but it's a tiny collection. While the Count is engaged in these excavations for Oxford, Schechter has a friend on the ground called Reginald Enrique, who is a Manchester businessman who Schechter befriended while he was in Cairo. And he's kind of acting as Schechter's spy and letting Schechter know that these things are being dug up for Oxford. And he's saying to him, "But don't worry, I'm going to get them for you." And so Enrique is taking stuff off the pile and getting it sent to Schechter. So there's a whole fascinating intrigue going on around the swooping up of these final pieces. But then it's also not the end of the story, because we have collectors on the scene, such as the Jerusalemite dealer known as Samuel Rafalovich. He's suddenly bringing along bags of materials, bringing them on visits to Europe, selling them to Moses Gaster in London, and selling them also to Schechter. And Elkan Adler's taking a few, and over in Paris they're taking some of Rafalovich's pieces. And with Rafalovich, the situation is complex, because he's also mixing up some of the Jerusalemite material in there, including Yemenite fragments. And then the story goes on, and then into the 20th century, we have more excavations take place with a character, I'll get it out in a minute, Cairo-born gentleman called Jack Mosseri. And Jack Mosseri engages in excavations in Cairo in the early 20th century and uncovers more material buried in the Basatine and around the synagogue. So there is by no means, Schechter is not an end to the story. It continued, and I think maybe you can see that when you look at the appendix of the book, which looks at the 50 known institutions to have so-called Cairo Genizah collections. And when you start looking at when they acquired them and where it's known from whom they acquired them, you can see that this is a story that took place before Schechter and after Schechter. Actually still ongoing today, because Genizah fragments still come up for sale on auction.
Wow. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a colorful and large cast of characters. It's almost like one of these I don't know, fantasy novels. We need like a index of the different cast of characters. It feels
Right.
like
Right.
Wheel of Time or something. I don't know. We need to have like a list of explaining who's who over here because
Right.
there's so many characters. That's not there is an appendix, like I said, which does list the major libraries, which is the collections, which is nice. But there's no but so there are definitely a lot of characters. So I mean,
Absolutely.
in summation over here, then so really when we have this quotation, I'm doing quotes, the Cairo Genizah.
Organiza.
I mean, what does that even what does that even mean to you? What should that mean to the listener after reading your book and looking at your research? What does that really mean? It means like, is it the Ben Ezra Genizah or it's not? It's just like you mentioned, everything's just all mixed up. I mean, just so what does it mean? What does it mean to you when we say the Cairo Genizah? What does that mean?
I think it's a good way to describe the archive as it now stands, a way to group the fragments in the various collections worldwide, but doesn't necessarily describe their origins accurately or their provenance stories accurately, and should not be confused with the Ben Ezra Synagogue find spot. So I think we need to do I think it's complicated, and I would say that I haven't come up with a good alternative. I think the wonderful scholar Marina Rusto once asked me, so what would you call it? Well, I've no idea actually. So I just think we just need to take a little bit more care when we say, oh, this is a Cairo Genizah fragment. Okay, just take a little bit more care in the way you're describing it, and make sure you know a little bit more about the fragment, where it came from, where it sits today, and how it might have got there. And so perhaps a good example is something that was shared over Twitter lately, and that's this wonderful little tiny fragments that are written in Old French, and they're a copy of they're a Latin copy of the Iliad, and this fantastic scholar called Gideon Bohack has done a little piece on them for the Genizah Research Center's newsletter, where he talks about, he analyzes this Latin copy of the Iliad, but he also concludes it's strange. Why is it in the Genizah? Why is it in the Cairo Genizah? How did it end up in Egypt? And he wonders whether it was originally part of a book binding, which would make sense. But that's the problem we have. You see, we want to fit it into this box. And so instead of looking at the piece and thinking, well, it's Old French, it's of the time of the Crusaders. It's Latin. Why aren't we looking to Jerusalem as the source? It fits a Jerusalem context much better than an Egyptian context. And that's how it might have come to us. It might have come to us through the Jerusalemite dealers as part of the things that they were sort of gathering up and selling on to Europe. So I think we've got to just be careful what we put in the Cairo Genizah box.
Right. It's like you're saying, it's all these collections when reading your story, I'm reading the book and then listening to it here. It's like, well, it could have been from any one of these dealers and collectors.
Right.
There's so many collections, and there were so many curators in charge of the collections and librarians, and everything's just like, and like you said, we get put in this box of the Cairo Genizah. Well, it's not exactly, it's a bit of a misnomer, essentially.
There's another great example, something I've been looking at myself recently. There's a prayer book, a complete prayer book in the Cambridge collections, and it's a 19th century prayer book. And in the fly leaves, it's got the name Simon Cairo on it and various members of the Cairo family. And when you do some research into the Cairo family, you actually find that they're an English family from Norwich. They're an English Jewish family from Norwich. This was the prayer book of somebody, a Norwich man. And in fact, it was probably the one given to him on, I think, is it your 9th birthday where you get given a siddur for the first time? I was trying to do some research on this.
I mean, that would be in England. I don't know what they did.
I think at this period, on your 9th birthday, you would be given a siddur, because that's when you'd be expected to start to learn the prayers. And it coincides, and there are dates in it that coincide beautifully with the research I've been able to do into the genealogy of this family. But it's called a Cairo at the moment. It's part of the Cairo Genizah. But it probably was never in Cairo. And it probably got mixed up as part of the whole process of cataloging this massive collection, which took place over many years.
Right. So this doesn't mean to downplay that probably the bulk of, especially in Cambridge,
yes, the bulk
is part of the Ben Ezra Genizah.
Yes,
right. And you had mentioned also there were other Genizahs, or again Genizot, that the stuff came from, even if not from the Ben Ezra. So they were all just like you're saying, things got mixed up. This also may matter. Just thinking also, now that the whole digitization project and people can now you can put fragments together. Something's in JTS and the other one's in Cambridge or in Oxford. So you can do that. It helps. I would guess it would help to know if it really was from the same Genizah or no. You're trying to look for that.
Right, absolutely. But yes, you're absolutely right. That doesn't take away. I don't want this story to take away from the fact that the bulk was definitely produced by the community, the Egyptian community, and their networks, and was placed in the Ben Ezra Synagogue Genizah. Definitely the bulk of that most particularly what scholars refer to as the classical Genizah period, which is when it would have been a Genizah that was in use, and that would have been sort of 10th century through to 13th century. That's our classical Genizah period, and that's where the bulk of the material actually comes from. It comes from that period. So yeah, definitely. Only occasionally, like with the medieval Latin piece that I mentioned, only occasionally do you get the piece where it's like, really, does that fit this story? But for the most part, yes.
So this is something that I mentioned in the beginning, so I want to get back to it. The book does, I guess this question would make more sense for listeners to read the book, but because we didn't get into as much of like the dealings or the shady dealings. But I mean, what does this tell us? The story tell us about the universities and all these libraries, their collecting practices, quote unquote, and how they came to possess their collections, and really the questions that this raises. Because I mean, you've definitely read the story in some of these books. I mean, even you mentioned letters. They're trying to, like, all these collectors, all these dealers. They were just, it seems like, I mean, they were just trying to sneak off with the community's treasures at the cheapest price possible. I mean, I'll let you talk about this.
Yes, it does bring into sharp focus a lot of dodgy practices, and in my epilogue, I talk about this just a little bit, and raise these as questions, which I hope other scholars will also take on and address. But it does call into question some of the practices, and at the same time, you know, it's so difficult, because what we have today is this massive treasure that has revolutionized our knowledge of the Jewish Mediterranean. As Goitein famously said, the Jewish Mediterranean society has revolutionized it, and so we won't want to be without it. And so you do have to question then, what is it? Is it better here as we have it today, in the shape that we have it today with all these lost provenance stories, or is it better sort of hidden away in a Genizah or buried somewhere? It's a difficult question to answer, but at the same time, I think we do have to look back and question some of those, because for the people whose material it was, who placed it in the Genizah, very often they had very deep feelings about disturbing this material, and I think that comes up a lot in the Firkovich story, where the communities are very disturbed by the idea of their Genizah being broken into, and have a lot of and they were often dismissed as, you know, just mere superstitions about, if you broke into the Genizah, it would bring a plague on the community, and sort of the sophisticated scholars can sneer at that, but that was, you know, it was still a little bit of a violation in many senses. And then also, of course, I ask questions about the early practices of some of these institutions. And again, I want to be really careful, because today these institutions are wonderful. I mean, they take beautiful care of their collections. They've initiated wonderful projects around them in digitization. And so I don't want to, I want to be careful about how I speak. It's really looking at what happened in that early period and some of the lack of care in careful documentation and occasionally in careful preservation of the materials, because a lot of it languished in boxes for many years before scholars became much more vocal about making sure that these materials were taken proper care of. And so, it does raise a lot of questions, and I can't really answer many of them.
Oh, for sure. And I wasn't saying like all what you just said, that it's great in these collections and it's curated and digitized. I just wanted to point out that,
yes,
like you mentioned in the book, that these questions exist, and especially reading this one. That's all.
Yes.
So finally, I think what do you hope to accomplish, or what are you trying to show people? No, I know, of course, accomplish, you're bringing the story to life. But I mean, with the story now, is it that all these, not that, like you said, you were the first one to talk about a lot of these stories, right, understood, but is it that you're trying to bring out as complete, as I'm sure it's not complete, but as complete of a picture as possible, and this is the overall story of the quote-unquote Cairo Genizah? Is that what the book is trying to do?
I think so. Yeah, I'm trying to tell as complete a story as I can at this point, knowing that there's more to uncover, and that someone might come along and say, "Nah, that's ridiculous. Look what happened. Look what really happened." I think we need to keep talking about this, and I think there's been too little focus on the wider story, and particularly because we've got all these collections around the world that they're often like sidelines to the main collection, or the early characters are kind of, I say in the book, treated as a walk onto the main event kind of thing, and I think our understanding of the Cairo Genizah and the nature of the Cairo Genizah and our understanding of the pieces in it would be so much more enriched by telling a fuller story about how we got them. I hope that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I will mention, so I don't think I mentioned this, that I'll put the link to purchase the book in the show's notes.
Thank you very much.
There's going to be two. Actually, we're recording this before it's published, but there will be a hardcover. I think it's $90, and then, but don't worry, the paperback will be $29.95.
Yeah.
Right, so very affordable paperback, and everyone can check it out. And it's, like I said, it's a really fascinating book. Very, very interesting to learn about the Genizah and the stories. And thank you once again for joining me to talk about it.
Thank you so much.